So what I will do is present the results of the systematic review and evidence synthesis on socio-economic impacts of GM crops. This has been done together with colleagues from the Technical University of Munich and from the Center for European Policy Studies in Leuven. I have here mentioned the main researchers that did contribute to this research. We had a number of master students and also did help us to comply with all the requirements for a systematic review. Space wouldn't allow to list them all here on this slide, but I really deeply like to acknowledge the contribution of the master students, otherwise we would not have been able to reach that stage here that we have reached today. Now, we followed the same procedure as has been mentioned by Thijs and by Jeremy already, so I will not repeat this. We also face some of the same struggles when going through this review process. But here, the main question that we were addressing is what research evidence exists on the socio-economic impacts of GM crops, and from that did result in a number of secondary questions: type of population, socio-economic impacts and crops and GM traits that have been addressed, the geographical focus, research methods used, and the analysis, and gaps in evidence that could be addressed in future primary research. Now, I use this slide here to illustrate what kind of challenges we face when we look at the economic implications of GMOs. Before I go into this, I like also to stress is that what we have done here is not unusual for economists. We do similar assessments for other technologies, being it organic agriculture, being this, for example, introduction of new fruit-free varieties, being the introduction of other type of new crop. So we are very familiar with this. The questions that we address, we normally address in general when we look at the socio-economic implications of new technologies. Now, here is the result from a study where 5 producers have been compared that cultivate BT and non-BT maize on their farms in Portugal. Now, when you look here at the yield effects, here producer 1 here has a higher yield on the BT maize than he has on the non-BT. Producer 2 the same, he has a higher yield on the BT than on the non-BT. But if you compare producer 1 and producer 2, and if you look at the non-BT of producer 1, this is higher than the BT on producer 2. So we have to be very careful when we just compare these data. We have to take into consideration that farms are substantially heterogeneous. And if you just do this comparison, you perhaps may come to the conclusion that BT maize may generate a lower yield than non-BT maize. And that would be a wrong conclusion. You have to consider the specific farm specificities in your assessment. Then here there are a number of costs, and here I like to stress the costs on insecticide use. There also can be substantial differences between the users. Some users that use non-BT have low insecticide use, and others may have a substantial higher expenditure on insecticide use. Further, we may observe that the gross margin for a specific farmer might be negative. But again, this should not lead us to the conclusion immediately that the BT technology did not generate a positive effect on a farm. That's why we are happy we had this producer number 5 who had a very bad year, and he had a negative gross margin on his BT maize, but he also had a negative gross margin on his non-BT maize. And in this specific case, it was the case that the losses on the BT maize cultivation were less than the losses he had with his non-BT maize cultivation. So we have to take all these into consideration when we look at farm level data and like to analyze those. Now in this slide, we have farmers that produce maize with BT and with non-BT. In many regions now, we observe that we have adoption rates that are almost close to 100%. So where it might be difficult to observe the counterfactual, think about Spain or think about the Midwest in the United States. So how can we then make such kind of comparisons between the non-BT and the BT maize production? What in those cases often then is done in the literature is to see, okay, how did the situation before the introduction of the BT technology did look like in comparison to the situation when it has been introduced. For example, there was one study that did look into the introduction of oilseed rape canola in Canada, where we have an adoption rate of more than 98%, and they were able to compare this before and after. But this all challenges our assessment, and we have to be very careful that those aspects are properly taken into consideration in the different studies. And we know that we have some econometric tools at hand that allow us to correct for what we call sample selection biases, for example, when we cannot observe the proper counterfactual. Now what we did is we had a number of review topics on farm level, consumer level, supply chain, environmental economics, and food security. These are the numbers of studies that finally have been included in the assessment. We looked at the macro level, we looked at the trade impacts and at the policies of GM crops. Now we had the search strategy by defining the terms, the databases, and the quality, where we looked at comprehensiveness and validity checks, if relevant references, and there we compared this with the 20 core reviews, meta-analysis that had been conducted in the literature, at least to make sure that in our review we have those studies that had already been contributed to other reviews. And this was a kind of study selection that we had identified, and the data extraction strategy. Now here's an example for the evidence maps. We started with a database of more than 38,000 observations. We screened them, reduced it to 26,000 observations, then screened the full text of 12,789, and then in the end we included 7,668 studies, and then we allocated them to the, in this case, to these 5 different topics, and these are the final numbers that have been taken into consideration. So it was a quite demanding exercise. And what we observed is that even so we try to really use a broad range of search items, we didn't find all the studies. We later checked them and then did identify a number of studies that were not found, even so we tried to be as comprehensive as possible. And this is a screening result for another example on the macro level impact. There we started with 9,941 references, and then in the end, after the full screening processes, included 43 studies in the final review assessment. Now we did the narrative data synthesis, and I will just report on those studies that have been done for the English language. We did the same for Spanish, for French, for German, and for Chinese. And when we look at the classification categories, what we find is that about 48% of the studies have addressed consumer level issues, 38% farm level issues. We had 4% addressing supply chains, 7% of the studies environmental economics, and 3% did address food security issues. The majority of the stakeholders involved were 47% farmers and 51% consumers, and then 1% of studies, they took the whole household into consideration, not differentiating between producer and consumers, and about 1% looked at the perspective from the stakeholders' experts' point of view. This is an interesting slide. It shows how the number of publications did develop over time. We observe a rapid increase until about 2000, and from there onwards the number of publications did decline, and perhaps the explanation for this is that number of research often also goes hand in hand with the opportunities for doing research, meaning to say funding plays also a very important role whether or not researchers get engaged in specific topics. Now the majority of the publications we considered were journal papers, 63%, and then we have other types of publications. This is the distribution by major geographical regions, and this here shows the number of countries grouped by development status, meaning to say developing versus developed countries. And what we observe here is that the majority of the studies have been done in developing countries in comparison to developed countries. And this here shows you the number of studies per classification. And when we look, for example, here at farm-level studies, most of the farm-level studies have been done in developing countries, while consumer-level studies, the majority has been in developed countries. This here shows the distribution by country. By and large, most of the studies, if we take them all together, have been done in the United States, and then India, China, Canada, UK, and South Africa. And the crops being investigated, cotton has been by far the most, has reached the most attention, followed by corn, soybean, then rapeseed and rice, and then a few others. The type of genetic modification, in most cases it has been general, it hasn't been differentiated, then followed by Bt crops and then herbicide tolerant crops. And the farm studies, they looked into profits, they looked into production efficiency, health, social, ethical, and cultural issues. They looked at gross income. 7% of the studies directly looked at the costs, and 39% on the decision or intent to adopt a new GMO crop variety, and those adoption studies are the majority at farm level. And when we look at consumer study, 46%, again, the intention to adapt to buy, 42% on the effects of price premia, and 12% are others. And out of this 12%, 61 studies did address the effect of media and information on consumer behavior. The supply chain, the majority on the costs and benefits and their distribution along the supply chain, the performance of actors within the supply chain, the structure, and other issues have been addressed. When we look at environmental economic studies, the majority looked at herbicides or insecticides, then this was followed by general environmental economic assessments, alternative practices, contribution of changes in yields to the environment, studies that addressed the role of the precautionary principle, and 9% looked at regulatory effects, regulatory issues and their effects on the environment. And if you look at food security studies, nutritional status was a majority, 41%. Sustainable agriculture and contribution to development, 23% of the studies, followed by poverty and health issues. When we look at the macroeconomic studies, we can group those studies by what kind of major stakeholder had been addressed in these macroeconomic studies. Again, consumers received the most attention, followed by producer. Media as one group was also very well represented, and then we have other input suppliers, intermediate actors, and civil society. Now, looking at the results on sectoral macro level impacts, if we take all models together, or if we differentiate by partial and general equilibrium models, we find a statistically significant positive effect of the introduction of GMOs in those economies that have been considered, and the effect depends on what kind of specific model you use. Now, the overall summary here is that farm and consumer level topics comprise about 86% of the studies. And most studies subtopics include farmer decision intent, cost-benefit analysis, environmental economics of herbicide, pesticide use, nutrition as part of food security. Asia and North America is a geographical region that received most of the attention, and among the crops, cotton and corn were the most studied ones. The study methodology were mostly observational, meaning to say ex post study. There have been only a few ex ante study, and most of the research design, we consider them as being non-experimental. We also looked at who was funding the study, and we could identify for 45% of the studies that the funding source had been identified. And we thought that actually industry-backed studies might have had a higher share, but among those that identified it, this was only 6.5%. But there are 55% where we could not identify the funding source. The overall limitations, when we summarize this, is that quality assessment of the individual studies so far was not part of our investigation and still has to follow. And with this, some of the results could be, in particular when we look at the soft studied topics, a little bit superficial, so we have to be very careful at this stage. Comparison, study by study, very difficult, and Jeremy already has pointed out, but of course we can summarize the results of individual studies and try to get an overall picture. Well, for not all studies, we've had the full text availability, as the others also faced in their reviews. And, well, we might not have had all the relevant literature. Very few studies were conducted in South America, even so South America is one of the regions where a large majority of GM crops is cultivated. Supply chain, environmental economics, and food security hasn't been addressed at the same level as farm level and consumer studies. Large share has been conducted in the United States for obvious reasons. For future research, I think the database that we have constructed is quite useful and can be updated by other researchers, or they can use this database for their own research and follow up on this. I think that is a very important contribution. Now let's go a little bit to some specific conclusions. When we look at the farm studies, those in developed countries are less than half those in developing countries. When we look at what kind of gains, we need to say gains and losses, I just said gains here, that have been investigated. These were mainly revenue, that was mainly health, and non-pecuniary benefits. So these are the three major items, and then some studies looked at some other issues as well. When we look at other issues, yield was very important, and in particular for BT crops and herbicide-resistant crops. When we just look at the outcome of the reported studies, we see an increase for BT crops. We haven't quantified this, while the yield effect of herbicide-resistant crops is mixed. When we look at the cost, what has been investigated, changes in pesticide use, expenditures on seeds, and weed and pest resistance had also become an issue in the literature and had been investigated. At consumer level, most studies have been conducted in developed countries. The results are mixed with respect to willingness to pay. We find studies that show a positive willingness to pay when consumers have been asked with respect to genetically modified food, and other studies show negative effects, and they basically depend on the design of the study. What is emerging there in the study is that an increase in education is correlated with a decrease in willingness to pay as well as age. Older people in general, when we look at the overall results of those studies, are less willing to pay for GMOs, as well as more educated people like those that we see here, perhaps. We observe a number of regional differences, and it's difficult to summarize this in a conclusive way, meaning to say there's a lot of heterogeneity, and it's difficult to say based on those studies that the Europeans are more concerned in comparison, for example, to the Americans. That is what cannot be concluded at this stage. Environmental economic studies, the majority has been done in developed countries. Environmental economic impacts, where researchers try to quantify from an economic point of view environmental issues, are related to pesticide use and greenhouse gas emission effects. That is where we find economic data. Other issues have been also addressed, but at qualitative level, and they include biodiversity effects, land use, soil erosion, and effects on natural habitats. On food securities, well, it's not surprising the majority of the studies have been conducted in developed countries. How household income has been reported. What those studies that had a dedicated focus on food security also included were gender aspects, and they had to do with the effects on changes in pesticide use as well as on weeding, and that is related to the source of the GM crop, meaning to say BT crops and herbicide-resistant crops. And what also has gained in importance is looking at biofortification from a food security point of view. At macro level, introduction does matter in terms of aggregate welfare change. I've shown the numbers. The estimates show that economic benefits are positive and significant. On average, producers are estimated to capture the largest share of the changes in economic benefits, followed then by industry, followed by consumers. But I have to add here, this depends how you construct your model. So it's very much model specific. We observe heterogeneous impact across the selected studies, meaning to say in some cases the benefits are very large, in other cases there are positive benefits but not that large. Again, the specific economic model being used matters a lot. On trade impacts, mixed result for trade flows. Can have positive as well as negative implications. Production and domestic prices are affected, and the results seem to be in line with our empirical literature. And again, the impacts are very heterogeneous, and that does also make sense. We have countries that have not included BT crops in the agriculture production system, and if you have an international trade model, those countries normally would suffer from the introduction of a BT crop in another country through international trade flows. Most literature focus on the impact at country level. We find no evidence that the introduction of the technology did have an effect on the overall agriculture policy. So we try to identify whether or not in those countries there was a link, for example, introducing BT crop in the United States, that the United States agriculture policy on import subsidies, on export tariffs, etc. would have changed. So far, we find no evidence. This does not imply there is none, but in the literature, this hasn't been discovered. And finally, on the politics of GM crops, well, there's no single explanation that accounts for all the remarkable differences in the approval processes. Many sources have been cited for this. Some have related differences in GM regulation to differences in consumer preference and citizens' trusts between the EU and the US, for example, triggered by the food crisis in Europe. Role and structure of the media seems to be pivotal in influencing food risk perception. This is what the studies that looked at media and information concluded. Comparative advantage factors between EU farmers, agrochemistry industry, US producer and biotech companies seem to be a more convincing argument for understanding the current GMO policies that we observe in specific countries than general consumer attitudes towards the technology. And finally, the importance of heterogeneity of interest within each group of actors has been emphasized, so you may observe different outcomes by different countries depending on how strong those interest groups are participate in agriculture policy debates. With this, I'd like to conclude and